In the gently rolling countryside of Henrico County, Virginia, where vast tobacco fields rippled like green oceans beneath the blazing summer sun of 1784, the Caldwell family stood among the most powerful and prosperous dynasties in the entire Commonwealth. To their neighbors and distinguished visitors, they represented everything admirable about post-evolutionary Virginia society: cultured, wealthy, and devoutly religious. Yet concealed deep within the walls of Millhaven Estate lurked a secret so profoundly disturbing that when it finally clawed its way into the light during the bitter winter of 1789, it would send violent tremors through the very foundations of Virginia's aristocratic world. Court records from that era, kept under seal for more than 2 centuries, expose a tale of cold, methodical deception, expertly forged documents, and a young woman who gradually discovered she had been deliberately shaped from early childhood for a purpose so sinister it challenges the boundaries of human comprehension. 23 witnesses provided testimony describing events so shocking that 3 separate judges removed themselves from the proceedings, declaring they lacked the moral capacity to continue. The authorities worked tirelessly to bury this story. The church flatly denied its existence, and every surviving member of the family abandoned Virginia permanently, vanishing without a trace. But the truth, as it inevitably does, eventually forced its way into the light. Before we go further into the story of Elizabeth Hartwell and the Caldwell family's forbidden secret, I want to take a moment to tell you that this channel exists to bring you the darkest and most deeply unsettling true stories buried within America's past. If you're discovering us for the first time, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into history's most chilling and forgotten mysteries, and drop a comment letting me know what state are you listening from. I genuinely love knowing where our community of mystery lovers is tuning in from across the country. The documents that managed to survive this devastating scandal would sit locked inside Richmond's courthouse basement until 1892, when a clerk cataloging neglected files stumbled upon them by pure accident. His written report to the Virginia Historical Society described the contents as far too disturbing for public consumption, and they were promptly sealed away again for another 50 years. The story itself traces its origins to the autumn of 1776, when Virginia was still staggering beneath the weight of revolutionary chaos and the fragile, intoxicating promise of independence. Millhaven Estate, spreading across nearly 3,000 acres of prime tobacco land, had remained in Caldwell hands for 3 full generations. The original land grant, personally signed by Governor Alexander Spotswood in 1722, had cemented the family among colonial Virginia's most elite, a position they had carefully defended through strategically arranged marriages, ruthless business dealings, and an iron commitment to preserving and expanding their wealth at any cost. The family patriarch, Jonathan Caldwell, was a figure of extraordinary influence, a former member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, a tobacco merchant with connections stretching from Richmond all the way to London, and a widower whose wife Catherine had died in childbirth just months before the Declaration of Independence was signed. At 42, Jonathan radiated the kind of commanding authority that made men fall silent and women avert their eyes when he entered a room. He stood well above 6 feet tall, with dark hair just beginning to silver at the temples, and eyes the color of winter steel. Every element of his bearing spoke of a man born and bred for absolute power. His late wife had been a Harrison, one of Virginia's oldest and most distinguished first families, whose bloodline could be traced directly to the earliest Jamestown settlers. Catherine Harrison Caldwell had brought both a substantial dowry and an unimpeachable social pedigree to their union, lifting the Caldwell name to the very highest levels of colonial society. Their brief marriage had been endlessly discussed among Richmond's social circles, representing the joining of 2 of the most formidable tobacco fortunes in the entire Commonwealth. The war had shattered traditional trade routes while simultaneously creating extraordinary opportunities for those calculating enough to navigate the shifting political landscape. Jonathan had been among the first Virginia planters to grasp that the new nation would demand new money, new alliances, and entirely new strategies for preserving old power. Unlike many of his fellow aristocrats who had clung to the crown out of tradition and sentiment, Jonathan had thrown his support behind the revolution from the very beginning, not out of any idealistic passion for liberty or democracy, but out of pure, unsentimental calculation. He understood clearly that independence would create new laws, new courts, and new opportunities for men sharp enough to exploit them. His gamble had paid off magnificently. While other planters struggled to find markets during the chaos of war, Jonathan had quietly established connections with French merchants through contacts in Philadelphia. While paper currency collapsed into worthlessness, he had insisted on gold and land deeds as payment. While neighboring estates crumbled under suffocating debt, Millhaven had flourished, steadily expanding its holdings by purchasing adjacent properties at a fraction of their peacetime value. But prosperity carried its own particular anxieties. Without a male heir, Jonathan faced the grim prospect of watching Millhaven estate carved up among distant cousins upon his death. Precisely the fate his grandfather, the original Jonathan Caldwell, had warned against in letters that still resided in the family strongbox. The old man had proven prophetic about many things: the supreme importance of land, the indispensable value of bloodline, and the absolute necessity of keeping family wealth consolidated at all costs. A fortune divided is a fortune destroyed, he had written in his final letter to his grandson. See that the Caldwell name and the Caldwell lands remain forever united, no matter what sacrifices this unity may require. The crushing weight of this ancestral commandment pressed down on Jonathan constantly as he contemplated his uncertain future. He had considered remarrying. Several prominent Virginia families had made carefully worded inquiries about their unmarried daughters, but Jonathan found the notion deeply unappealing. He had grown entirely accustomed to absolute dominion over his domain, and the prospect of once again negotiating with a strong-willed woman who possessed her own family loyalties and opinions about estate management held absolutely no appeal. More troubling still was the question of loyalty. Any wife he took would inevitably import her own family's competing interests into the household, potentially diluting his singular focus on perpetuating the Caldwell legacy. What Jonathan required was not a partner but an instrument, someone utterly devoted to his singular vision, completely dependent on his protection, and bound to him by ties that no mere marriage contract could dissolve or challenge. It was against this chilling backdrop of calculation and ancestral obligation that fate, or perhaps something far more deliberately orchestrated, delivered Elizabeth Hartwell directly into Jonathan's waiting hands. November rain hammered against the windows of Millhaven's great house with steadily mounting fury as the storm that would alter everything gathered its full terrible strength. Jonathan sat in his walnut-paneled study, reviewing shipping manifests by the dancing glow of 3 silver candelabras, French pieces that had been Catherine's contribution to the household. The room was a perfect reflection of his character, every book precisely arranged, every document filed according to his exacting system, every surface polished to a mirror brightness by servants who understood their master's standards, permitted absolutely no compromise. The plantation ledgers spread before him told a story of almost unprecedented success. The tobacco harvest had surpassed all expectations. The new French contracts had proven even more profitable than his most optimistic projections. His Richmond real estate investments were yielding returns that made him one of the wealthiest men in all of Virginia. Yet something gnawed persistently at him as he worked, the relentless awareness that all this accumulated wealth would be utterly meaningless if he could not guarantee its preservation for generations that followed. It was approaching midnight when Samuel Brigham, his overseer, materialized in the doorway. Brigham was a lean, deeply weathered man who had served the Caldwell family for more than 2 decades, first under Jonathan's father, and now under Jonathan himself. His loyalty was absolute, his discretion beyond question, and his demonstrated willingness to carry out orders without raising uncomfortable questions had been tested and proven on more than one occasion, Master Caldwell, Brigham said, his voice carrying an unusual gravity that immediately sharpened Jonathan's attention. There's been an accident on the Richmond Road. A carriage overturned in the storm. Appears to be quality folk, sir. Jonathan set down his quill with deliberate, measured care. Quality folk meant responsibility, particularly for a man of his standing in the community. More importantly, they frequently meant opportunity. How far from our gates? Perhaps 2 miles, sir, near Devil's Elbow, where the road curves around the creek. The driver is dead, sir, and the gentleman and lady, Brigham, shook his head slowly. They were thrown clear when the carriage rolled, but neither survived the fall. The horses bolted, but we managed to retrieve the baggage. Survivors. A child, sir, a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years of age. She was thrown into the bushes, probably what saved her life. The girl keeps asking for her Uncle Thomas, but she's in shock, sir. Doesn't seem to recall much else about what happened. Jonathan's mind began immediately calculating possibilities. Orphaned children from quality families often presented interesting opportunities for a man with the resources and connections to exploit them properly. What of identification? Papers, letters, anything that might tell us who they were. Brigham's expression shifted to one of careful neutrality, an expression Jonathan immediately recognized as signaling information his overseer preferred not to discuss openly. Found some documents in the gentleman's coat, sir. The name appears to be William Hartwell, traveling with his wife Margaret and their daughter. They were carrying a considerable sum in gold, sir. Payment for land. They were apparently planning to purchase out in the Kentucky territories. The mention of gold sparked Jonathan's immediate interest, but it was Brigham's carefully measured tone that captured his full attention. There was something the overseer was deliberately withholding, something that required a far more private conversation. Bring the child here immediately, Jonathan instructed. See that she's cleaned, fed, and given dry clothing, and Samuel. He paused, holding his overseer's gaze with a look that communicated volumes without a single spoken word. We'll discuss the other details of this unfortunate accident in private, once the child is settled. What Jonathan encountered when he entered the guest bedroom an hour later would remain burned into his memory for the rest of his life. The child sat perched on the edge of the four-poster bed that had once belonged to his grandmother, still wearing a nightgown that Martha, the head house servant, had located for her. Despite everything she had just endured, there was something unmistakably refined about the way she carried herself, the careful manner in which her hands rested folded in her lap, the precise pronunciation of her words when she thanked Martha for the warm milk, the evident quality of the discarded dress now steaming dry beside the fire. But it was her face that truly arrested Jonathan's attention. The child bore a startling resemblance to his late wife Catherine, particularly around the eyes and the delicate architecture of her jaw. Her hair, once washed and dried, proved to be the same rich chestnut brown that Catherine's had been. And when those large dark eyes lifted to meet his, Jonathan felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it momentarily stopped his breath. "What is your name, child?" Jonathan asked, his voice taking on an unusual gentleness as he drew up the room's single chair and positioned himself at her eye level. "Elizabeth Hartwell," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the polished accent of educated society. "My parents, are they truly gone? Your man said there was an accident, but I thought perhaps—" The question dissolved into the air like smoke from the dying fire. Jonathan studied the girl's face more carefully, noting not just her remarkable resemblance to Catherine, but also the unmistakable intelligence that flickered in her eyes despite her obvious distress. This was no common orphan, no simple farm child who could be dismissed or quietly forgotten. This was clearly a child of good breeding, educated, articulate, and possessed of precisely the kind of quality that would be searched for and mourned if she simply vanished. But she was also completely alone, deeply frightened, and utterly dependent on his charity for basic survival. I'm afraid so, my dear, Jonathan said softly, reaching out to pat her hand in what appeared to be a gesture of fatherly comfort. But you are safe now. Tomorrow we will make inquiries about this Uncle Thomas you mentioned. We will find your family and see that you are properly cared for. Even as these reassuring words left his lips, Jonathan's mind was already racing through possibilities that would have horrified any decent man. Here was a child of obvious quality, orphaned, isolated, with family connections that were apparently distant and virtually impossible to verify. The possibilities were not merely intriguing, they were extraordinary. "Thank you, sir," Elizabeth said, her natural courtesy shining through the exhaustion and grief. "You're very kind to take me in. I don't know what would have become of me if your man hadn't found me." Jonathan's smile was warm and deeply reassuring, expertly concealing thoughts that were anything but paternal. "Think nothing of it, my dear. It is our Christian duty to help those in need, and I suspect you and I are going to become very well acquainted indeed." That night, while Elizabeth slept in the guest room under Martha's watchful eye, Jonathan met with Samuel Brigham in the estate's wine cellar, a location chosen specifically for its absolute privacy and the certainty that no conversation could be overheard through its thick stone walls. What passed between them in that dimly lit chamber would set in motion events of unimaginable consequence. The first letter of inquiry Jonathan drafted was never sent. Instead, it joined a steadily growing collection of documents inside a locked drawer of his study, documents that told a very different story from the one he carefully presented to his neighbors and to the local authorities. Through methodical and patient investigation, Jonathan learned that Elizabeth's parents, William and Margaret Hartwell, had indeed been traveling to meet relatives in the western counties when their fatal accident occurred. But these relatives lived in remote mountain settlements near the Kentucky border, communities so isolated that communication was sporadic at best and often required months to cross the treacherous wilderness roads between them. More crucially, the Hartwells had been relative newcomers to Virginia, having relocated from Maryland just 5 years earlier to establish a small but profitable shipping business in Norfolk. This meant their local connections were limited, their social circle was narrow, and their sudden disappearance would almost certainly be attributed to the well-known dangers of frontier travel, rather than to any foul play. Within a month of the accident, Jonathan had constructed a masterwork of deception that revealed both the brilliance of his intellect and the complete absence of any moral constraint. He presented himself to the county clerk as Elizabeth's appointed guardian, producing carefully forged documents claiming that her mysterious Uncle Thomas had perished of fever in the Kentucky wilderness just weeks before her parents' carriage accident. The timing was flawless, tragic enough to evoke genuine sympathy, recent enough to explain why no one had been formally notified, and geographically remote enough to make any verification effectively impossible. As her only surviving connection to Virginia society, Jonathan had generously agreed to raise the girl as his ward, a charitable act that burnished his reputation as a Christian gentleman while serving his own purposes with chilling perfection. The county clerk, overwhelmed by the administrative chaos left in the war's wake and deeply impressed by Jonathan's position in the community, accepted the documents without a single question and officially appointed him as Elizabeth's legal guardian. The transition was gradual and exquisitely orchestrated. Elizabeth, traumatized by her devastating losses and deliberately isolated at the remote plantation, slowly came to accept Jonathan as her protector and benefactor. He hired Miss Adelaide Fenwick, an educated spinster from Richmond, as her private tutor, ensuring Elizabeth received the education appropriate to her apparent station while carefully regulating every aspect of her exposure to the outside world. He ensured the household staff treated her with consistent kindness and respect, provided beautiful clothing and carefully selected books, and began the slow, patient process of molding her into precisely what his needs required. But Jonathan's plans demanded far more than simple guardianship. In the winter of 1778, he traveled to Richmond for meetings that would prove absolutely crucial to his ultimate design. There, In the elegant offices of his attorney Cornelius Vance, Jonathan executed a series of legal maneuvers breathtaking in both their audacity and their cold sophistication. Vance was a man who deeply understood the value of professional discretion and the critical importance of never asking uncomfortable questions when dealing with clients of Jonathan's caliber. Short and precise, with thinning gray hair and the soft, uncalloused hands of a man who had never performed a day of manual labor, he had built his entire practice on serving the complex legal needs of Virginia's plantation elite. His offices occupied the second floor of a federal-style building on Main Street, furnished with imported mahogany and lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound legal volumes representing decades of mastery over the intricacies of property law, inheritance rights, and marriage contracts. First, Jonathan had Vance draft formal adoption papers, making Elizabeth legally his daughter and his potential heir to the entirety of Millhaven Estate. The documents were masterpieces of legal precision, establishing not only his complete parental authority over her, but also her rights to inherit in the absence of any other direct heirs. To any casual observer, this appeared to be nothing more than the generous act of a childless widower providing security and stability for an orphan child. Second, and far more remarkably, he had Vance prepare what appeared on its surface to be a standard marriage contract, but one containing a peculiar provision that would only become significant years later. The contract was between Jonathan Caldwell of Millhaven Estate, Henrico County, and a young woman of suitable breeding and education, to be determined at a future date. The language was deliberately imprecise, the timeline deliberately open-ended, and the specific identity of the bride deliberately omitted. Vance, generously compensated for both his professional discretion and his willingness to draft unusual documents without inconvenient questions, raised no objections to the arrangement. The adoption papers were filed with the county clerk and entered into the public record. The marriage contract was not. It remained locked within Vance's private files, waiting patiently for the appropriate moment to be executed. As Elizabeth grew from child to young woman under Jonathan's carefully controlled environment, his attention to the details of her education became almost obsessive in its focused intensity. She studied French with a private tutor, Latin with the local minister, mathematics and literature under Miss Fenwick, and household management through careful observation of Martha's daily responsibilities. She was schooled in every social grace expected of a plantation mistress, drilled in the intricate protocols of Virginia aristocratic society, and trained in the complex business operations that kept a great estate profitable and growing. To outside observers, Jonathan was simply ensuring that his adopted daughter would make a suitable match when she came of age, perhaps to a younger son of good family who needed a bride with property, or to a rising merchant who could benefit from connection to the distinguished Caldwell name. His dedication to her education was widely admired as commendable, his paternal affection viewed as genuinely touching, and his careful plans for her future regarded as entirely appropriate. But there were other lessons running underneath the surface, subtle, sustained conditioning that had begun when Elizabeth was still far too young to grasp its true implications. Jonathan spoke frequently and with great conviction of the supreme importance of family loyalty above all else, of the sacred bonds that transcended the conventional rules of society, and of biblical precedents that existed for unusual family arrangements that served God's higher and ultimately unknowable purposes. He told her elaborate stories of the ancient patriarchs, men who had maintained multiple wives and deeply complex family structures, specifically to ensure the survival of their bloodlines through the most desperate of times. He spoke endlessly of the Caldwell family's long and difficult history, dwelling on the profound sacrifices that previous generations had made to preserve their land and legacy. He told her of ancestors who had died defending what was theirs, of family members who had made agonizing choices to ensure the family's continued survival, and of the sacred obligation that each living generation owed both to those who had come before and to those who would follow. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Jonathan began to emphasize Elizabeth's unique and irreplaceable role within this unfolding generational saga. She was not merely his adopted daughter, he explained with quiet but unmistakable intensity. She was the living key to preserving everything the Caldwell family had built and sacrificed for over the course of generations. She was intelligent enough to comprehend business, beautiful enough to reflect nothing but credit upon the family name, and loyal enough to place family obligations above personal desires or individual happiness. By 1782, when Elizabeth was 16 and flowering into a young woman of remarkable beauty and formidable intelligence, the psychological foundation of Jonathan's long gestating plan was nearly complete. She had been systematically isolated from all contact with young men her own age, told repeatedly that her destiny lay in preserving the Caldwell legacy, and conditioned over many years to view Jonathan not simply as her adoptive father, but as the absolute center of her universe and the sole architect of her future. The final and most dangerous phase of Jonathan's plan began in the spring of 1784, when he announced to Elizabeth that he had received correspondence from a distant cousin who wished to arrange a marriage that would unite two branches of the Caldwell family and guarantee the estate's preservation for generations to come. The proposed match, he explained, represented the culmination of years of extraordinarily careful planning and would secure her future completely while honoring the profound obligations she owed to the family that had raised and protected her. Elizabeth's first glimpse of her intended husband came in the form of an exquisite miniature portrait that Jonathan presented to her in his study on a warm April morning. The painting, set within an ornate gold frame and obviously executed by a highly skilled artist, depicted a man bearing a striking resemblance to Jonathan himself, the same strong jaw, the same penetrating dark eyes, the same quiet air of absolute authority that seemed to emanate powerfully even from the small painted image. "His name is Jonathan Caldwell," her adoptive father explained, his voice carefully neutral as he watched her reaction to the portrait. "He is a cousin from the western counties, a man of excellent character and substantial means who has built quite a successful tobacco operation in the mountains. The marriage would unite our family holdings permanently and ensure that Millhaven Estate remains entirely intact for the generations that follow." Elizabeth studied the portrait with mounting confusion, noting details that seemed strangely familiar yet simultaneously impossible. The man's clothing was expensive but unmistakably dated, his formal pose characteristic of portraits painted a full decade earlier. Most troubling of all was the uncanny, almost supernatural resemblance to Jonathan, so pronounced they might easily have been brothers rather than distant cousins. "But his name is the same as yours, Papa," she said, using the affectionate term she had called him since early childhood. "How can this be? I thought our family naming customs were considerably more varied." Jonathan's explanation was simultaneously brilliant and horrifying in its cold, premeditated simplicity. The cousin, he explained patiently, had been named for the same celebrated ancestor, a common enough practice in colonial families seeking to honor their forebears and maintain meaningful connections across generations. This Jonathan Caldwell had inherited land in the Shenandoah Valley and established a flourishing tobacco operation there, but he lacked the refined social connections and cultural polish that came with the Caldwell family's generations of established wealth and position in Richmond society. The marriage would benefit both parties substantially. The cousin would gain access to Virginia's aristocratic inner circles and the formidable business connections that came with the Caldwell name, while Elizabeth would help preserve the family estate and secure her own future beyond any doubt. More than anything, the union would keep the family wealth tightly consolidated rather than allowing it to scatter among distant relatives who might not share their fierce commitment to preserving the Caldwell legacy. "But I would be leaving you," Elizabeth said quietly, and Jonathan was deeply gratified to detect genuine distress in her voice. Over the years, he had cultivated her emotional dependence on him with extraordinary patience, ensuring that the very thought of separation would be not merely uncomfortable but psychologically devastating. "Not leaving, my dear," Jonathan replied, his voice warm with paternal affection that masked darker and more terrible currents of satisfaction. "Expanding our family, this union has been arranged with the greatest possible care to ensure that you will never be far from those who love you most. In fact, the arrangement specifically provides for your new husband to spend considerable time here at Millhaven, helping to manage the combined operations of both estates." The wedding preparations commenced immediately, but they were unlike anything Elizabeth had observed during her occasional visits to neighboring plantations or her infrequent appearances at Richmond society events. Rather than the magnificent public ceremony typical of Virginia plantation society, with its elaborate guest lists, weeks of festivities, and celebrations potentially involving hundreds of family members, business associates, and friends, this would be a strictly private affair conducted at Millhaven Estate itself, with only a small number of very carefully selected witnesses in attendance. Jonathan explained this highly unusual arrangement as a practical necessity of both logistical and social considerations. Many prominent families remained widely scattered by the recent conflict. Travel through large parts of Virginia was still genuinely dangerous, and the groom's family had expressed a strong preference for a simple ceremony that would not interfere with the complex business negotiations forming part of the marriage settlement. Additionally, the bride's orphan status made a large public celebration fundamentally inappropriate. It would be far more seemly to conduct the ceremony with quiet dignity and measured restraint, rather than with elaborate festivities that might seem painfully insensitive given her tragic personal history. As summer surrendered to autumn, Elizabeth found herself growing increasingly troubled by aspects of the arrangement that simply refused to align properly. Despite her deeply ingrained respect for Jonathan's judgment and her profound gratitude for his years of care, certain things gnawed at her relentlessly. The wedding invitations, which she was never permitted to see personally, were allegedly dispatched to the groom's family and various distant Caldwell relatives, yet no responses ever materialized. At Millhaven, when she asked to read the acceptances and regrets that should have been arriving regularly from invited guests, Jonathan explained smoothly that all such correspondence was being routed through his Richmond attorney to spare her any unnecessary administrative burden. When she requested permission to exchange letters with her intended husband before the ceremony, a perfectly reasonable desire that would allow them to form even the most basic acquaintance before their wedding day, Jonathan explained that the man was currently traveling extensively on business through the Western Territories and strongly preferred maintaining the traditional formality of limited premarital contact. Such restraint, Jonathan assured her with practiced conviction, was actually a mark of profound respect and serious intent rather than indifference. Most deeply disturbing of all were the legal documents that Cornelius Vance brought to Millhaven in September, riding out from Richmond in a hired carriage loaded with leather portfolios and mahogany document cases. Elizabeth was asked to place her signature on various papers relating to her inheritance rights, the marriage settlement, and the complex business arrangements that would formally unite the two branches of the Caldwell family. But whenever she attempted to read them with care, both Jonathan and Vance assured her that the legal language was simply far too complex for anyone without formal legal training to properly comprehend. These are merely the standard formalities required by Virginia law, Vance explained in his precisely modulated professional manner. Routine documents establishing your rights both as heir to the Caldwell estate and as a bride entering into a marriage contract involving substantial property considerations. Your signatures are necessary to make the arrangements legally binding, but the actual terms have been personally negotiated by your father and myself with the sole purpose of ensuring your complete and permanent protection. One document in particular arrested Elizabeth's attention, a property deed that appeared to transfer her inheritance rights as Jonathan's adopted daughter to someone else entirely. When she raised this alarming discovery, Jonathan's response was smooth and unmistakably rehearsed. Upon her marriage, he explained, her legal status would naturally transition from daughter to daughter-in-law of the Caldwell family, and the paperwork simply reflected this necessary change in status while ensuring her ultimate inheritance rights remained fully intact. But Elizabeth was considerably more intelligent than Jonathan had perhaps anticipated, despite his years of painstaking psychological conditioning. The very education he had provided her had included sufficient exposure to legal concepts and property law that she could recognize with growing dread that something about these arrangements was fundamentally and irreparably wrong. The language of the documents seemed deliberately constructed to obscure rather than clarify. The timing of the paperwork felt dangerously rushed, and every explanation she received seemed designed not to provide genuine understanding, but to actively discourage any further inquiry. Late at night, alone in the privacy of her bedroom, she began methodically assembling the pieces of a puzzle whose completed image filled her with cold, paralyzing terror. The truth began unraveling on a frigid October evening when Elizabeth made a discovery that would change everything irrevocably. Unable to sleep, a combination of mounting anxiety about the approaching wedding and persistent, gnawing doubts about the arrangements Jonathan had made, she had gone to his study to retrieve a volume of poetry, fully expecting to find the room empty. The great house was silent except for the familiar settling sounds of old timber and the distant murmur of wind moving through bare branches outside. Instead of the empty room she had anticipated, she found Jonathan working by candlelight, carefully reviewing documents spread across his mahogany desk in neat, methodical rows. The scene was lit by the same 3 silver candelabras whose dancing shadows climbed the walls between the leather-bound books and the family portraits that seemed to watch everything with silently disapproving eyes. As she moved closer, about to announce her presence, she glimpsed something that turned her blood to ice and seized the air from her lungs. Among the documents lay the miniature portrait of her intended husband, but positioned directly beside it was a small mirror, angled so that Jonathan could compare his own reflection to the painted image. Even more disturbing, she could see that he was making subtle adjustments to his hair and facial expression, apparently practicing to match the portrait's pose with the greatest possible precision. Elizabeth retreated silently, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain Jonathan would hear it despite his apparent total concentration. Her mind reeled as she struggled desperately to process what she had just witnessed. The resemblance between Jonathan and the man in the portrait was not coincidental. It was absolute because they were identical, because they were the same person. But how was this possible? What conceivable explanation could exist for a deception of such monstrous elaborateness? The answer that came to her was so profoundly evil she could barely force herself to acknowledge it. Yet it explained with terrible completeness every single thing that had troubled her about the wedding arrangements. There was no cousin, there had never been any cousin. Jonathan intended to marry her himself, using a fabricated identity to make the arrangement appear legitimate while preserving the legal fiction of their father-daughter relationship intact. Over the days that followed, Elizabeth conducted her own quiet, meticulous investigation, drawing upon precisely the skills of careful observation and systematic analysis that Jonathan himself had taught her throughout her years of education and training. She began with the household correspondence, examining letters whenever opportunities arose during her lessons with Miss Fenwick, or her conversations with Martha about the wedding preparations. What she found chilled her to the very marrow of her bones and confirmed every one of her worst suspicions. There were no letters whatsoever from any cousin named Jonathan Caldwell. There were, however, communications from Cornelius Vance discussing the special arrangements and emphasizing the absolute necessity of complete discretion regarding the unusual nature of the ceremony. There were also bills from a Richmond portrait artist for modifications made to an existing miniature, and payments to various merchants for clothing and accessories that appeared specifically designed to alter someone's recognizable appearance. The decisive breakthrough came when Elizabeth discovered a locked drawer in Jonathan's study during one of his trips to Richmond on business. Using a hairpin and techniques she had carefully absorbed while watching Martha repair household locks over the years, She managed to open it while the house was occupied with afternoon routines, and her presence in the study would raise no suspicion. Inside, she found documents that revealed the full, terrible scope of his deception. The original inquiry letters about her parents that had never been dispatched, the forged guardianship papers establishing his false authority over her, the fabricated correspondence, supposedly from the fictional cousin, expressing eager anticipation of the approaching marriage, and most damning of everything, detailed notes written in Jonathan's own distinctive hand, outlining his plans for their wedding night and for the many years that were to follow. But it was the marriage contract that exposed the full and absolute horror of her situation. The document, written out in Vance's careful legal script, was between Jonathan Caldwell of Millhaven Estate, Henrico County, and Elizabeth Hartwell, legally adopted daughter of the aforementioned Jonathan Caldwell. There was no mention anywhere of any cousin. The groom and the adoptive father were explicitly and unambiguously identified as the same individual. The implications crashed over Elizabeth like a wave of ice water, leaving her trembling and nauseated as she sat in Jonathan's own chair, reading documents that laid out her fate with dispassionate, businesslike precision of a commercial transaction. Every act of kindness he had shown her, every lesson he had imparted, every moment of paternal affection he had performed, all of it had been a calculated, methodically executed step toward this ultimate violation. She had been groomed from the time she was a child to become not merely his heir but his wife, a woman who would exist simultaneously as his daughter and his bride, ensuring that his bloodline continued while his estate remained permanently under his absolute and unchallenged control. The most terrifying dimension of the scheme was its cold legal sophistication and the complete and total helplessness it created for her. By adopting her first, Jonathan had established both her inheritance rights and his paternal authority over her. By marrying her afterward, he would maintain permanent control over the estate while ensuring that any children produced by their union would be indisputably legitimate heirs to the Caldwell fortune. In the complex legal landscape of post-revolutionary Virginia, where property rights were paramount and family bloodlines determined social standing and survival, the arrangement was profoundly disturbing, but not necessarily illegal. Even more horrifying were Jonathan's notes about his long-range plans. He had calculated with cold precision that Elizabeth's youth and his established social position would allow them to present themselves as a conventional married couple. When traveling or conducting business away from Millhaven, the adoption papers would remain on file but never referenced. The marriage certificate would carry only their names, containing no indication of their prior relationship, and their children would grow up knowing Jonathan only as their father, never learning the truth about their mother's origins or the crimes that had shaped her fate. That night, Elizabeth lay rigid in the darkness, methodically planning her escape. But as dawn's pale light began to creep through her windows, she confronted the horrible truth. She had nowhere to go and no resources of her own. Jonathan had been meticulous, almost surgical, in his isolation of her from the world beyond Millhaven's gates. She had no friends of her own age, no connections to families who might help her, no money or property held in her own name. Even if she could somehow prove what he intended to do, the very documents that constituted her evidence had been crafted with sufficient legal cunning to make her appear complicit in the arrangement. The wedding was scheduled for November the 15th, barely 3 weeks away. Time was running out, and Jonathan's trap was very nearly perfect in its cruel, suffocating completeness. Elizabeth's chance arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor who appeared at Millhaven Estate like an answer to the most desperate of prayers. On November the 3rd, a traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Hartley presented himself at their gates, seeking shelter for a night during his long journey between parishes scattered across the Virginia countryside. His surname made Elizabeth's heart lurch with a violent mixture of hope and terror. Could this man possibly carry some connection to her true family? Reverend Hartley was a man of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair and the permanently weathered complexion of someone who spent the majority of his life traveling rough, unforgiving roads between distant settlements. His clothing identified him as a man of modest means but entirely respectable station, and his conversation over dinner revealed an encyclopedic knowledge of Virginia's families and their interwoven histories, knowledge accumulated through decades of performing baptisms, marriages, and funeral services throughout the entire Commonwealth. During the evening meal served in Millhaven's formal dining room, beneath the painted eyes of Caldwell ancestors, Elizabeth listened with fierce, hidden attention as Reverend Hartley spoke of his travels throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. He told stories of frontier settlements, remote isolated plantations, and the profound challenges of ministering to communities scattered across hundreds of miles of untamed wilderness. When Jonathan stepped briefly away to instruct Samuel Brigham about accommodations for their guest, Elizabeth seized her moment. "Reverend Hartley," she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled despite the surging excitement and terror coursing through her. "Might I ask, did you ever know a family by the name of Hartwell? I believe they may have been distant relations of mine." The minister's weathered face immediately brightened with recognition and unmistakable warmth. "Indeed I did, child. William and Margaret Hartwell, the tragic loss, that carriage accident some years back. They were good, faithful people, devout Christians who attended my services whenever their business brought them to Norfolk. They spoke of their daughter often, a bright young girl they were planning to take to live with Margaret's brother in the Kentucky territories after completing some business dealings in the West." Elizabeth's composure nearly shattered entirely as she heard confirmation of facts Jonathan had sworn were impossible to verify. "Her brother." "Brother Thomas, yes. Thomas Whitfield was his name, though Margaret had kept her maiden name of Hartwell after marriage, which is not uncommon in families where the woman brings significant property to the union. Last I heard, he was still operating a trading post near Harrodsburg, still hoping for some word of his sister's family, actually quite troubled that they never arrived for their planned meeting. Why do you ask, child?" Before Elizabeth could respond, Jonathan reappeared in the dining room doorway, and the conversation was forced to shift to other, safer ground. But Elizabeth had learned enough to confirm her worst fears while simultaneously discovering something of breathtaking importance, that she had real family, living family, still alive somewhere and still actively searching for her. And the Uncle Thomas whose death Jonathan had fabricated was in truth Margaret's brother, carried an entirely different surname, and was not only very much alive but desperately seeking news of her parents' fate. That night, Elizabeth made a decision of desperate and terrifying courage that would demand every last ounce of intelligence and resolve she possessed. She would confront Jonathan directly, not to plead for mercy or negotiate her freedom, but to extract the evidence she would need to expose his crimes to Reverend Hartley. If she could convince the minister to carry word of her situation to the proper authorities in Richmond, she might yet have a chance to escape the trap that had been slowly and methodically closing around her for 13 years. She waited until the household was completely still, then moved silently through the darkened corridors to Jonathan's study, where she knew he frequently worked deep into the night, reviewing correspondence and estate records. She found him exactly as she had expected, reviewing the final arrangements for their wedding ceremony. The forged documents fanned out before him like the battle plans of a military campaign. When he looked up and found her standing in the doorway, still in her white nightgown, his expression shifted in an instant from surprise to something infinitely more dangerous, a cold reptilian calculation that reminded her with brutal force that she was entirely alone with a man who had already proven himself capable of murder without remorse. "Elizabeth," he said with perfect calm, setting down his quill with deliberate, unhurried precision. "You should be sleeping. Tomorrow there are many preparations still to be completed for our wedding ceremony." The possessive weight he placed upon the word "our" sent a wave of cold through her entire body. But Elizabeth forced herself to remain steady. "There is no cousin," she said, and her voice was surprisingly strong despite the terror flooding through her veins. "There never was. You intend to marry me yourself. Jonathan's mask of paternal affection finally fell away completely, revealing the cold predator that had always existed beneath the surface. The transformation was terrifying in its absolute completeness. Every trace of fatherly warmth vanished instantly, replaced by the calculating, utterly passionless gaze of a man whose carefully constructed plans had been discovered, yet who remained completely confident in his ability to contain the situation. "You are more perceptive than I had anticipated," he said, rising slowly from his chair. His imposing frame cast long, distorted shadows in the candlelight, and Elizabeth was reminded with violent clarity of precisely how physically powerless she was against him. "Yes, there is no cousin. Yes, in 12 days you will become my wife. You will also continue to be my daughter, my heir, and the mother of the children who will carry the Caldwell name into the future. It is an arrangement that serves every relevant interest with perfect efficiency, every interest but my own," Elizabeth replied, and she was quietly astonished by her own boldness in the face of such overwhelming and immediate danger. Jonathan's smile was as cold as moonlight on winter ice, stripped of every trace of human warmth. "Your interests are my interests, Elizabeth. They have been since the night I found you orphaned and alone on the Richmond Road. Do you truly imagine your rescue was mere chance? Do you believe I chose to raise and educate you, and provide for your every need out of simple Christian charity?" The implication carried within those words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she had barely permitted herself to fully acknowledge. "The carriage accident, you knew about it beforehand? I arranged it," Jonathan said, with precisely the same casual, untroubled tone a man might use to discuss the weather. "Your parents were traveling with a considerable sum of money, payment for land they intended to purchase in Kentucky. My men were instructed to seize the carriage and retrieve the funds, but you were an unexpected bonus. When I saw how remarkably you resembled my dear Catherine, I understood that Providence had provided me with something immeasurably more valuable than mere gold." The full, staggering horror of her reality crystallized in that moment with annihilating clarity. Her parents had not died in a random accident. They had been deliberately murdered on Jonathan's orders for their money. She had not been rescued, she had been kidnapped. Everything about her life for the past 13 years, every kindness, every lesson, every carefully performed expression of paternal love, had been constructed on a foundation of murder, theft, and the premeditated, systematic grooming of a stolen child for purposes so evil they defied any moral vocabulary. "The law will not permit this," Elizabeth said, though even as the words left her lips, she understood their profound futility in a society where women possessed virtually no rights independent of the men who controlled them. Jonathan's laughter was genuine, resonating off the walls lined with law books and the portraits of his ancestors. "The law, my dear, is precisely whatever men of my position and resources choose to make it. You are legally my daughter, which places you under my absolute authority until the moment of our marriage. You will then legally become my wife, which means you will remain under my authority permanently thereafter. Every document is properly executed, witnessed by men of standing, and filed with the appropriate courts. There is no law in Virginia or anywhere else in this republic that can reach us." He moved steadily closer as he spoke, and Elizabeth could detect the faint scent of brandy on his breath and see the cold, absolute satisfaction in his eyes as he contemplated his complete and total triumph over her will and her future. "More importantly, my dear, you have nowhere whatsoever to go, and not a single person in this world to help you. Your precious Uncle Thomas believes you perished with your parents 13 years ago. You have no friends, no money, no connections to anyone capable of assisting you. Even if you somehow managed to escape Millhaven, you would be a penniless orphan with no proof of identity and no means of survival." But Jonathan had fatally underestimated one critical element. Elizabeth's desperation had been matched and magnified over 13 years by an education of extraordinary breadth and depth. She had learned not only literature and mathematics, but the far more dangerous arts of reading human nature, understanding hidden motivations, and identifying the specific vulnerabilities of specific people, and she had identified Jonathan's single greatest weakness with the cold clarity of genuine understanding, his overwhelming, consuming pride in the brilliance of his own mind. "You're right," she said softly, carefully allowing the sound of defeat to saturate her voice. "I have no choice but to accept what you have planned, but I need to understand one thing before I resign myself to this fate. How did you know my parents would be traveling that particular road, carrying so much gold? How did you arrange such a perfectly timed ambush?" Jonathan's expression shifted subtly into one of deeply satisfied pride as he recognized what he took to be her final surrender. Like so many brilliant criminals before him, he could not ultimately resist the opportunity to explain the magnificent cleverness of his scheme to an audience capable of truly appreciating its complexity. "Your father was a fool," he said, settling comfortably back into his chair with the air of a man savoring a richly deserved triumph. "He advertised his business dealings far too openly, spoke with inexcusable carelessness in Norfolk taverns about his intentions to purchase land in Kentucky. It was simple enough to learn the full details of his planned journey, the route he intended to travel, and the fact that he would be carrying sufficient gold to complete the purchase." As Jonathan continued his account, detailing with evident pride the months of patient planning that had preceded her parents' murders and her own abduction, Elizabeth absorbed and memorized every single word with absolute precision. She had no weapon, she had no means of overpowering him physically, but she possessed something potentially far more powerful than either a witness sleeping upstairs who carried both the moral authority of the church and the legal standing to be believed and taken seriously by magistrates and courts. What followed that night became the subject of whispered speculation throughout Henrico County for decades, a story interweaving elements of justice, courage, and what many who heard it chose to interpret as divine providence in ways that resisted simple or comfortable explanation. On the morning of November the 15th, 1789, the very day scheduled for the ceremony that would have completed Jonathan's monstrous design, Millhaven Estate erupted in a chaos so total and so swift that it would destroy the Caldwell family permanently and drag into the light secrets that had been buried for 13 years. Elizabeth's plan was elegant in its simplicity and utterly devastating in its execution. Born from 13 years of intense education and the absolute desperation of a woman with nothing left to lose, she had spent the preceding 12 days not in passive resignation as Jonathan believed, but in meticulous, systematic preparation that drew upon every skill he had painstakingly taught her. Using her detailed knowledge of the household's daily routines, her legitimate access to Jonathan's study during his regular morning inspections of the plantation, and her hard-won understanding of the legal and financial systems he had used to sustain his deception across more than a decade, she had methodically assembled a body of evidence comprehensive enough to be overwhelming and specific enough to be irrefutable. The documentation she compiled was staggering in both its scope and its devastating specificity. She had carefully reproduced the forged guardianship papers establishing Jonathan's false authority over her. She had copied the fabricated correspondence from the fictional cousin. She had transcribed the detailed financial records, clearly showing payments to the men who had executed the attack on the Hartwell carriage. And most importantly, she had secured Jonathan's own handwritten notes laying out his long-term plans for their marriage and for the children he fully expected her to bear him. But Elizabeth understood, with the clear-eyed realism of someone who had studied Jonathan's methods for years, that evidence alone would not be sufficient to bring down a man of his extraordinary wealth, his extensive political connections, and his carefully cultivated social standing. She needed something more dramatic, more public, and more legally unimpeachable. She needed witnesses whose combined testimony could not be silenced, suppressed, or dismissed. And she needed to engineer a confrontation that would expose Jonathan's crimes in such a public and indelible manner that denial would be rendered permanently and completely impossible. The wedding ceremony was scheduled to proceed in Millhaven's Great Hall, with Reverend Charles Peaton officiating and a carefully curated gathering of witnesses that included Cornelius Vance, several Neighboring planters with their wives, local magistrates, and a selection of Richmond society's most prominent figures. To these assembled witnesses, the event was intended to appear as nothing more remarkable than a devoted guardian marrying his adopted daughter, unusual perhaps, but not without precedent in a society where property considerations routinely and openly governed matrimonial arrangements. Elizabeth appeared in her bridal gown, a dress of ivory silk that had originally belonged to Jonathan's first wife, Catherine, altered to accommodate her smaller frame, looking pale but composed, with a steadiness that masked the screaming urgency beneath. Her hair had been dressed in the elaborate style fashionable in Virginia society, adorned with the same pearls that had been Catherine's wedding jewelry. To the assembled guests, she appeared to be a beautiful and appropriately nervous bride, perhaps overwhelmed by the momentous significance of the occasion but visibly resigned to her duty. Jonathan stood beside her in his finest clothing, a coat of midnight blue wool, a buff, colored waistcoat, and a pristine white stock that emphasized the commanding presence he wore like a second skin. His satisfaction was written in every line of his posture, as he prepared to achieve something he had spent over a decade engineering with meticulous and criminal care. A marriage that would simultaneously preserve his estate, perpetuate his bloodline, and maintain his social standing, while violating every moral principle that civilized society had constructed to protect its most vulnerable. Reverend Peaton, an elderly minister who had served Virginia's plantation society for more than 30 years, began the ceremony with the traditional words that had joined countless couples throughout the Commonwealth. His voice carried the full, settled weight of religious authority as he spoke of the sacred bonds of matrimony, the mutual duties of husband and wife, and the divine blessing that attended the union of two souls in Christian marriage. As the ceremony proceeded through its familiar, ancient rhythms, the assembled witnesses relaxed into the comforting embrace of ritual. This was, after all, simply another plantation wedding, unusual in its particular circumstances, perhaps, but following patterns they had all witnessed many times before. Reverend Peaton had reached the traditional moment of impediment, the ancient invitation that every wedding ceremony contains. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. And then Elizabeth spoke, her voice cutting through the ceremonial atmosphere with the clean, cold precision of a blade. "I must confess a deception before God and these witnesses." The words fell into the hushed hall like stones into still water. "I am not Elizabeth Caldwell, adopted daughter of Jonathan Caldwell. I am Elizabeth Hartwell, and this man murdered my parents to steal their gold and kidnap me, for the precise purpose you see unfolding before you today." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Jonathan moved instantly to silence her, claiming with practiced authority that she was suffering from bridal nerves and the hysteria that sometimes afflicted young women unable to bear the weight of impending matrimonial responsibility. But Elizabeth had prepared for this precise moment with the meticulous thoroughness of an attorney preparing for the most consequential trial of a career. She produced the documents she had taken from his study, distributing them with calm and deliberate precision to Reverend Peaton and the assembled witnesses. Her composure so absolute, her presentation so methodical, that her accusations became impossible to dismiss as the disorganized outburst of a hysterical bride. As the evidence passed from hand to hand among men who understood legal documents and financial records, the full catastrophic scope of Jonathan's crimes became completely and entirely undeniable. The forged adoption papers with their carefully executed alterations and fabricated signatures, the correspondence planning her parents' murder, written in Jonathan's own unmistakable hand, the financial records documenting payments to Samuel Brigham and others for special services rendered on the Richmond Road on a specific night 13 years prior, the detailed notes outlining his systematic grooming of Elizabeth from childhood toward this ultimate violation. It was all there, documented with the same obsessive, meticulous precision that had characterized every aspect of Jonathan's planning, never imagining for a single moment that these records would be turned against him in a room full of Virginia's magistrates. But Elizabeth had preserved one final revelation, one that would ensure beyond all possibility of doubt that Jonathan could never find legal refuge or escape justice through the manipulation of social connections that had served him so reliably throughout his life. "There is one further crime you must know of," she announced, her voice completely steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. Mr. Caldwell's first wife, Catherine, did not die in childbirth, as he has claimed to this community for 13 years. I discovered her diary hidden within the basement of this house, along with correspondence from Dr. Marcus Fleming of Richmond, describing symptoms entirely consistent with arsenic poisoning. She died by poison, administered by her husband when she discovered his relationships with enslaved women on this estate, and threatened to expose him to Richmond society. The combined accusations of uxoricide, kidnapping, and the premeditated double murder of Elizabeth's parents created a scandal of such magnitude that even Jonathan's extraordinary wealth and his formidable network of social and political connections could not begin to contain it. Several of the witnesses were themselves magistrates, men whose legal training left them fully capable of evaluating the validity and weight of the evidence Elizabeth had presented. Without hesitation, they placed Jonathan under immediate arrest pending formal investigation, despite his escalating protests and his increasingly frantic attempts to reframe the entire proceeding as a conspiracy orchestrated by a dangerously unstable young woman with unknown motivations. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational in all of Virginia's early history, attracting coverage from newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Boston, and drawing observers from across the new republic. Jonathan attempted to construct a defense centered on assertions that Elizabeth was mentally unstable, that the damning documents had been forged by resentful servants, and that the entire affair represented a conspiracy designed specifically to deprive him of his property. But the evidence was crushing in its weight and unmistakable in its implications. Elizabeth's testimony was delivered with a calm and articulate intelligence that commanded the courtroom and was supported by mountains of physical documentation. Even Jonathan's former allies in Virginia society, men who had dined at his table, accepted his hospitality, and benefited from his connections for years, began quietly and then visibly distancing themselves from a man whose crimes had become impossible to minimize or explain away. The prosecution, led by Virginia's most distinguished legal minds, presented to the court a portrait of calculated, sustained evil that shook even the most hardened among its observers. Here, laid bare without softening, was a man who had murdered 3 people for money, kidnapped a child, and spent 13 years in the systematic psychological preparation of that child for sexual exploitation, all while maintaining with extraordinary skill and discipline the public facade of Christian respectability and civic virtue. The case became both a legal landmark and a moral symbol, a stark representation of the corrupting effects of completely unchecked power and the indispensable importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members from those with both the will and the resources to exploit them. Jonathan Caldwell was convicted on every charge brought against him: murder in the first degree for the deaths of William and Margaret Hartwell, kidnapping and false imprisonment for his treatment of Elizabeth across 13 years of her life, fraud for the extensive web of forged documents, and murder in the first degree for the poisoning death of his first wife, Catherine. The sentence was death by hanging, carried out in Richmond on March the 15th, 1790, before an enormous crowd that included many of the same distinguished society figures who had once competed eagerly for invitations to Millhaven Estate's celebrated dinners. Elizabeth used her inheritance legally and unambiguously hers as Jonathan's adopted daughter and the sole surviving victim of his crimes to locate and reach her uncle Thomas Whitfield in Kentucky territories. The journey required 3 months and the active assistance of federal marshals to complete, but she eventually found him still tending his trading post near Harrodsburg, still quietly and desperately hoping for some word of his lost family. Their reunion was charged with tears and with a complicated, aching joy, for Elizabeth carried wounds that no reunion, however tender and longed for, could ever fully heal. 13 years of sophisticated psychological manipulation had left permanent marks on her soul, and the knowledge that she had narrowly escaped a fate most people in her world could not even bring themselves to name had altered something fundamental and irretrievable within her. She never married. Despite receiving numerous proposals from men drawn by her beauty, her formidable intelligence, and her substantial inherited wealth, the very idea of placing herself legally under any man's authority remained too terrifying, too viscerally connected to the trap from which she had escaped by the thinnest possible margin. Instead, she directed every resource she possessed toward establishing schools for orphan children throughout Kentucky and Virginia, creating institutions where vulnerable young people could receive genuine education and meaningful legal protection without being exploited by those who performed the gestures of care while concealing predatory intentions. The schools she founded became models for child welfare institutions across the expanding nation, distinguished by their emphasis not merely on education but on robust legal protections for orphans and systematic processes for verifying the backgrounds and motivations of those who sought to adopt or employ children in their households. Her work left a measurable and permanent mark on the development of legal safeguards that would protect countless children in the decades that followed, a legacy born directly from the ruins of her own stolen childhood. Elizabeth died in 1847 at the age of 81, surrounded by some of the hundreds of children whose lives she had materially saved and permanently improved over her decades of dedicated work. Her funeral was attended by governors, senators, and prominent citizens from across the nation, each paying tribute to a woman who had transformed incomprehensible personal tragedy into a lifetime of fierce and tireless service to others. Millhaven Estate was sold to meet legal debts and victim compensation obligations, but the great house stood empty for years before it was finally demolished. Local residents reported with unshakable conviction that crops would not properly grow on the land where it had stood, and that livestock refused to graze in the fields where Jonathan had spent decades planning his crimes. The property remained vacant for well over a century, eventually becoming part of a state forest where visitors today can still discover the old foundation stones partially buried in the undergrowth. Though very few who find them know anything of the dark and terrible history they mark, the Caldwell name vanished from Virginia society entirely. Distant relatives changed their surnames or relocated to other states, unable to endure the permanent stigma of association with Jonathan's crimes. The family's place in the social hierarchy, which had seemed so absolute, so immovable, so thoroughly carved from the bedrock of Virginia life, evaporated completely within a single generation, leaving not even a ghost of its former prominence. Proof, perhaps more eloquent than any argument, that even the most carefully maintained facade of respectability cannot ultimately withstand the patient, relentless pressure of truth. Samuel Brigham, Jonathan's overseer and the man who had actively participated in the murders, was tried separately and hanged 6 months after his master. Cornelius Vance, the attorney who had provided the legal architecture that made the deceptions possible, was disbarred and fled Virginia to escape prosecution, though he was eventually located and imprisoned for fraud and criminal conspiracy. The case became a cautionary tale studied in law schools and theological seminaries across the young republic, a case study in how corruption and abuse of power can flourish and sustain themselves indefinitely when society fails in its fundamental duty to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Elizabeth's courage in speaking the truth despite the overwhelming personal risk she faced and the seemingly insurmountable power of her oppressor became an enduring inspiration for the reformers who worked in the decades that followed to establish genuine legal protections for women and children across the nation. This story holds up a mirror to something we would prefer not to see: how effortlessly evil can shelter itself behind the masks of social respectability and religious observance, how terrifyingly easy it is to exploit those whose vulnerability we claim to be protecting, and how courage and intelligence, when combined in a single desperate human being, can ultimately dismantle even the most carefully engineered and seemingly inescapable of crimes. Elizabeth Hartwell's refusal to remain silent not only preserved her own life, It prevented Jonathan Caldwell from claiming further victims, and it helped build the foundations of protections that would shelter countless children in the years to come. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that systematic deceptions of this scale and sophistication were genuinely possible in the legal chaos of post-evolutionary America? How do you think Elizabeth found the courage to risk everything to stand in that hall and speak, when she had absolutely no guarantee that anyone present would believe her or be willing to help her? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and share this with someone who appreciates stories of human courage, confronting calculated evil, and refusing to yield. If this dark chapter from Virginia's buried history left an impression on you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, ring the notification bell, and join us every week as we excavate America's most chilling and forgotten mysteries. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters are almost always the ones wearing the most civilized faces, and that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply the refusal to stay silent.